Okay, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited for my guests today. I told him before we began recording that Rod, your work was very influential to me. I'm somebody who came into the church. I know you hear this all the time because your work is something that influences many people. Now, I'm a little bit different because your work tends to have an influence on people with a background similar to yours, which is Protestant. I, in fact, came from a non-religious, atheistic background.
That's great.
And I was just trying to figure out which, if any, sort of form, if you will, of Christianity is true. And so your book was Four Witnesses was one of those books that pretty quickly steered me in a heavily Catholic direction. So like I said, I'm sure you hear it all the time, but it's true. You're an influence to me and many others. So it's great to be connected and have you.
Well, that's a blessing to hear. I need to hear that sort of thing as often as possible.
Great. So you have a new book out. We're gonna talk about that, obviously. But since this is your first time on the show, some, I guess, formalities are in order. So Rod, for people who might not be familiar with you and your story and your work, start us off if you don't mind. Who are you?
Sure, I'll try to not to put you to sleep. So we'll do the short version. I was raised as a Southern Baptist in Georgia, even though I'm from Tennessee originally.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I'm speaking to you now from the family farm that's been in our family since 1819. So we just had our bicentennial on this property about 2 years ago.
Cheers. Yeah.
So that's fun. I live just about 5 miles from the southern tip of the Great Smokies Mountains National Park, which explains my funny hillbilly accent. So I have to.
I find it charming. So yeah.
Well, and I tell my Catholic audiences tend to be heavily weighted towards Northern Americans. So I tell them I will be careful to speak slowly and enunciate. So.
Yeah, you're coming through perfectly clear. So.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. I will make the long story very short. My faith probably in the 70s was saved by discovering Jesus movement type hippies, barefooted people that came up and sang about Jesus and strummed guitars and stuff. That was the most authentic thing I'd seen at the time. And a lot of my influences when I was young was on the countercultural side. So that was a way to keep my faith alive until I discovered a version of faith that actually made sense intellectually to me. I think I would have had a second crisis if I hadn't discovered C.S. Lewis when I was in my early 20s.
Sure.
It's a pretty well beaten path in conversion stories that Lewis led me to consider a more high church version of Christianity. I don't know the right term, liturgical, Anglo-Catholic in his case, even though he didn't like the term and begged off from it. But at the same time, I mean, he was ready to use phrases like the Blessed Sacrament and the Blessed Mother, and he defended purgatory and things like that. So, Jack, if you're listening, you were Anglo-Catholic. You just didn't admit it.
Yeah.
So,
can I actually ask you a question right there?
Sure.
Because there's always been this thing about that Lewis. It just sort of irked me a little bit. It seemed like a small inconsistency. I wonder if or maybe even a large one, because he's famous for his trilemma, right? Which is a very ancient argument, right? You see either God or bad man, like going way back. So it's not original to him, but he presented it, right? And the idea is like, look, if these are historically credible claims of Christ, avoiding the legendary accounts.
Yeah, that's the most important step.
Yeah. Yes. If they are historically credible claims of Christ, then like there's not really a lot of wiggle room here. Like either he is who he said he is, or this dude's a lunatic or a bad man, right?
Right.
And I still think there's a lot of force to that once we see that they are historically credible claims, right? However, it seems like he totally missed the parallel with Catholicism. He looked at the Catholic Church as sort of as an institution that just like studies ancient Christianity. But that isn't the sort of claims that the Catholic Church makes about herself. Right? The Catholic Church,
no doubt about it.
The Catholic Church makes pretty radical claims about herself in the same way that you either got to be like, yeah, this is either true or that this is an evil, like completely bonkers thing.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? Maybe you could build on that a little bit.
Well, in a previous interview about this book, one of my Catholic commentators, interviewers said, well, you take a minute to establish the idea that Christ intended the apostles to be his vicars, we speak about Peter in a special way as the vicar of Christ, but they were all vicars in the sense that they all act in persona Christi. He empowered them to continue his mission after he had gone, after the ascension, and that the bulk of the mission would be accomplished by them. So they are standing in his place, as mediators of his message from God to man, indispensable vicars, indispensable mediators. And the commentator said, well, this is a shocking claim for many people who hear this. It seems like you're saying that these guys are God, or that they're that they've taken the place in your mind that only Christ or the Father himself should have. And I don't know if he expected me to beg off on that, but you can't. Jesus said in no uncertain terms, he said to the apostles, the context is very important. To the apostles, he said, whoever hears you, hears me. Whoever hears me, hears the one who sent me, that is God the Father.
Right.
Contrariwise, whoever rejects you, or in another translation, despises or spurns you, despises me. And whoever despises me, despises my Father. So that's an absolute chain of connection where God the Father himself, according to Christ, promises to guarantee what these 12 men say is the gospel.
Yeah.
And they absolutely are acting as his vicars. They're standing in, not for Christ only, but for his Father as well. Jesus says, as the Father has sent me, in just that same way, I send you. And the word there is apostle, that the word being used. As the Father apostled me, so I apostle you. So the linkage is absolute. And so, again, an organization that tells you that you have to listen to our 12 founders, or you're rejecting God.
That's a big claim. It's a big claim.
Yeah,
it's not
a bad claim, if not true.
A bad claim. It's not like this is the thing that's always bothered me about Lewis. I love him. I love his work, but this just seemed like such a blind spot, because he thought the Catholic Church was sort of like a Platonic society. That's how he described it, right?
Yeah.
A group that kind of tries to study Plato and tries to get him right. That's not at all what the Catholic Church claims, right? So,
strangely enough, when he starts talking about the Catholic Church in a way that includes Anglicanism in its separated state, and there was the Anglo-Catholic theory of that we're a branch of the original church, and that just happens that we're on the outs with that Italian prelate. But other than that, we're just the English branch of Catholicism. When he starts talking that way, he talks like a Catholic. Yeah. And but yeah, he can get in when you get him on his hot spot, if you get him on the controverted subject. And it did stir up strong feelings. He knew very well it was the cause of the loss of his friendship with Professor Tolkien, and caused a lot of pride. And it was something I'm sure that bothered him. People asked him even while he was alive, why didn't C.S. Lewis become Catholic? And I don't like to read people's mail that way. I don't, people ask me, why didn't somebody become Catholic? I say it's his business, and under God, it's his business, and it's not helpful. I
agree.
Lewis led me to Chesterton, and Chesterton said the worst thing, and he spent a long time, he's like me, he spent 10 years or something working through high Anglican / high church ideas before he was willing to convert. People don't realize Chesterton, a lot of what, Orthodoxy, one of his famous books was written.
That was 10 years before he converted.
1908, and he was converted in 1922, I believe.
Yeah.
And so a bulk of what most people think of as Chesterton's writings was written while he was a Protestant. So, but so I can't criticize him for taking a long time, but because I did it myself. It took me 10 years.
Of course. Yeah. Right. So, I completely agree. And there's always a kind of like tricky thing here, right? There's clearly God's providence, because how many people like you would have even read Lewis, who served as a bridge to Chesterton, who served as a bridge, as I know your story, to Newman, right? Would you even touch Lewis if he was Catholic?
No. In fact, when he recommended G.K. Chesterton as the number one book that most affected him in his conversion to theism and then Christianity. He mentioned Chesterton's Everlasting Man, which is one of the greatest Christian books ever written. So I went out and got a copy. And I didn't know that Chesterton was Roman Catholic, as the phrase goes. So when I discovered that, I thought, oh no, what have I done? I've let the Trojan horse into the gate. And so I was scared of the book. I took it and put it in a drawer. I should have thrown it away if I was logically consistent. I took it and put it in a drawer and hid it so that it wouldn't scare me if I wouldn't see it and get upset by it.
Right.
But I didn't throw it away, and I eventually, of course, got it back out again. But so having done all that foolish stuff myself, this stuff's very personal to people, and I don't criticize them for being slow to come to the point. So
absolutely.
I was myself. So
hey, yes, and look, he's not here to defend himself, and we all have our blind spots. So the best we can do is just try to make sure we're checking those areas, right? So okay, sorry for the little digression there, but I really appreciate your comments on it. So continue the story. So Lewis brings you to Chesterton, and you hide the book for a while because it's the Trojan horse, but you took it back out at some point, right?
I did.
Yeah. Continue.
And then very quickly, Chesterton said the greatest book he ever read, or one of them, was Newman's Apologia. So I read that, and that was one of the greatest books I ever read. And of course, that was I was getting pretty close to the gate, but even then, I read the Apologia for the first time during the first Gulf War under George I. So that was 1991, maybe 91, late 90 into 91.
Sure.
And I didn't come into the church till the Easter Vigil of 96. So there was still plenty of dawdlation to accomplish before.
It's a good word.
Before I was ready to put my money where my mouth was. But intellectually, I was converted after reading the Apologia a couple of times. Because I'm not really a very smart person, so I had to read it a couple of times. It was difficult to understand in those days.
Newman is a beautiful writer, but he's somebody that you have to take a couple of passes through. There's no doubt.
Buy an annotated copy. That's true of Chesterton also. People say, I can't understand Chesterton. Chesterton, unlike Lewis, was a pundit. In other words, he was a journalist. He was somebody that was interacting with the news of the day. So that means that a lot of his references are ephemeral.
That's right.
They're about things that nobody remembers anymore, or not many people do. So an annotated edition of both writers is really, really helpful for people who have found Lewis meaningful but had to stop because they didn't understand Chester.
Yeah, that's good advice, and I would also endorse that. So Rod, then what's the connection? Was it Newman linked you with the fathers, and then is that what did it for you? And then that led to four witnesses after that.
Well, Lewis started out on the evangelical side of Anglicanism, found his way to a high Anglicanism.
Sure.
Chesterton started out as low church, latitudinarianism. His family was, I think maybe nominally Anglican still, but very unorthodox. And then he found his way all the way to the Catholic Church. Newman started it. Not many people comment on the fact that Newman started as a evangelical. His early influences were low church evangelical Anglicanism. So, and then he found his way to the church fathers, which was the major, the church fathers, I've told people, are the smoking gun. I know it's offensive to tell anybody that there's a smoking gun argument for the Catholic Church, but I will say this, that the fathers rule out an entire class of arguments against Catholic Christianity.
To be sure,
Like for example, when you, like I did, believed that devotions to Mary had arisen late in the Middle Ages, and I was actually fairly sympathetic to them. I said, the women were treated hard in the Dark Ages, and the church tried to compensate for that by magnifying female saints, and especially the mother of our Savior, and therefore they ended up overdoing it and making kind of a goddess out of her because we needed a goddess. And that was my take on it all. Airy speculation, as it turns out. But the point is, if you think that devotion, calling Mary the mother of God, for instance, if you think that that was invented in the Middle Ages, when you discover in the writings of Origen that he called her the mother of God in 240 AD, you haven't proved that she's the mother of God, but you have proved that it was not a lay decretion.
That's right.
That it was not something that a barnacle that stuck on the side of the ship from having been in the water too long. And there's a whole set of arguments against Catholicism that are based on the idea that man-made accretions have collected all over the original ship, the bark founded by Christ, and that we got to strip those things away and get back to pure early Christianity.
Yes.
When you discover that pure early Christianity was all full of Catholic ideas that I thought were purely Catholic and purely inventions of the Middle Ages, then you end up realizing that about half of your ammunition against Catholicism is gone. The rest, you may still have some good arguments. So I'm not saying you're stupid to continue not to be Catholic, but I do say that you can't do it for that reason.
Right. Yes.
These are late additions, these ideas.
That's a really good clarification. I'd like to ask you a little bit before we start getting into specifics of your newest book about methodology. So I didn't come from a Protestant background. I've got many Protestant friends. God bless them. Many Protestants listen to this. So I guess I've approached this a little bit differently than I think a lot of people do. Because the first step for me was sort of, Rod, it was my background's philosophy and I spent a lot of time in metaphysics and stuff like that. So it was really moving from a naturalistic paradigm to a paradigm of classical theism. I became
if you don't mind my asking, did you have any kind of religion as a child? Were you raised in any kind of faith?
I was baptized, but grew up in a really nominally religious environment. So I had doubts very early on, like early middle school, and then by high school, various influences. A lot of writers actually at the time, like Mark Twain and H.L. Mencken, got me interested in philosophy from an atheistic existentialist point, really. And that was sort of my entry point to philosophy.
By the way, Mark Twain is my great uncle.
Is he really?
He is.
That's amazing. So, I mean, like I've always been so curious on his sort of relation to religion because it's so mixed.
Oh, yeah.
You know? It was so like, and it doesn't seem like anybody's quite sure where he landed up. But anyway, as a young teenager, I was really attracted to his very polemical remarks about religion a lot of times.
Not all of which were published during his lifetime.
Yeah. So, I'm not making any claims that I know where he landed up. I don't, but he influenced me in a very negative direction to religion.
Against religion, yeah.
Against religion, right. And but at the same time, I mean, he wrote that book on Joan of Arc and called her the greatest woman that ever lived. So like there was clearly a pull going on in his life. He's really fascinating. It is
fascinating. He says that's the greatest book he ever wrote. He says, I know it very well.
Yeah.
And it's the greatest.
So like to me, that's like that it just seems like God really was pulling him towards the Catholic Church in an interesting way.
My own feeling is that Mark Twain grew up on the frontier at a time when the multiplicity of sects would drive any person insane. Any thinking person.
Yeah.
And the nuttiness that he saw in frontier Christianity, Missouri in the 1820s, would drive any person. Right. And I think it made him allergic to the name Jesus.
That is a theory consistent with how I've thought about it as well.
Yeah, I think he had heard it he'd heard it one time too often. And Jesus knew this about Sam and Uncle Sam in my case.
Yeah, I love it. I didn't know I was going to get a descendant of Mark Twain on the show.
Jesus knew this about Sam and said, well, I can't take the direct route here. I'm going to have to use a mediator.
Yeah.
So he sent one of his saints instead. He sent Joan.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. God bless him. No, I think that's probably almost certainly correct. But anyways, as a teenager, he influenced me in that direction.
Right.
That worldview collapsed for me. I did become convinced of not just theism, but classical theism. And that sort of like narrows your list of religious options. I'm influenced by a lot of Thomistic thinkers. So I start getting interested in Christianity. And then, the question comes up, is any form of this actually true? And that's where I really start becoming interested in the historical questions. I encounter works like yours and all these others. And, but I never really looked at it as saying, well, look, here's a definitive historical case for Catholicism. The way I always thought about it was like, here's the Catholic worldview, here's the Protestant worldview. What makes the best sense of the total accumulation of data, right? Because anybody can dial up the skepticism. And,
Sure.
my friend Trent Horn has been pointing this out recently of like when Protestants argue like atheists, right? So you're talking
Right.
with atheists, you might give some arguments for the initial stage of the cosmological argument, and then they'll become increasingly skeptical and say, okay, but that doesn't prove Christianity. Well, hold on a minute. I didn't say it did, right? This is just a step. And
this spirit of skepticism is a pretty easy trick to learn. And once you've learned it, you can use it on anything. You can disprove anything.
Right.
And if you insist on doing it.
Right. And many Protestants, again, God bless them, not all, but many will seem to take the same approach to various historical data, like, I don't know, First Clement or something. Okay. All right, maybe that's something, but it doesn't prove papal, say, supremacy or jurisdiction.
Right.
Okay, didn't say it did, but this is better expected if that hypothesis is true than if it's not. So I'm still claiming it as evidentially favoring my hypothesis. And then I've got this, and this. And yes, I grant that Protestants can mine different quotes from Augustine or Cyril that seem initially to fit with a Protestant paradigm. But what I'm saying, Rod, I want your thoughts on, when we look at the whole of the data and we compare to different paradigms, I'm bold like you. I think it is decisive. And for somebody who came into it with really no dog in the fight, it seemed initially quite clear to me. And it's only, I think, become substantially clear the further I've investigated it. But I guess what I'm saying is, like, what's the methodology you think somebody should use here to avoid getting into these scenarios where we're thinking that any one data point is meant to prove Catholicism, rather than there's sort of a collective cumulative case to be made here? What are your thoughts on all that?
I would suggest a self-examination. And there's the one and only thing that kept me for a long time from doing what in good conscience I thought that I should do. In fact, I've spent 4 years in an Anglican church or Episcopalian. And when I finally left, I had to apologize to the pastor. And I did it very sincerely. I said, I feel like I've abused your hospitality. When I came here, I pretty consciously knew that I was using you as a halfway house to Rome. And I had an idea that I would wind up there. And I was just medicating myself. And as a result, I wasn't a good, wholehearted Anglican like you needed and like you deserve. You need the people who go to church here to be in good faith about what they're doing. And I wasn't completely in good faith. Right. So, but the reason that I was stuck in such a weird hole mentally was because I just wasn't ready to go there yet.
Sure.
That phrase, that modern parlance of they just wouldn't go there, not willing to go there. I wasn't willing to go there. So a self-examination on the part of everybody who's considering these questions is in order before you ever get started. Am I willing to go there? In other words, if I discover that the picture that Catholicism gives of the early church makes more sense than the picture that I'm creating to counter those claims, am I willing to go there? You just kind of have to ask yourself, if God were to convince me that I've been selling the church short on this and that I need to pay attention in a different spirit, would I be willing to do that? Or would I just simply say, I already ruled that out? And let's just say, bottom line, if you've already ruled out Catholicism, it's better for you not to look at it.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean that sincerely. In other words, if you've already ruled it out and you're just simply not willing to go there, then it's spiritually bad for you. I think it lessens your chance of going to heaven, rather than, not because you didn't become Catholic, but because you weren't single-minded. Let your yay be yay and your nay be nay. It would be better for you to, and sometimes in the wrong spirit, a modernist type Christian has been known, or a Catholic priest even has been known to tell inquirers, no, go home and be the best Methodist that you can be. Go home and be the best Presbyterian. I think that's my advice too. If if you just won't go there. It's bad for you to mess around in it if it's just something that you're doing as a hobby or as but if you just won't go there, but it's something that's interesting to you and you've got an itch to talk it down, that's not spiritually good for anybody. So go, yes, be careful about how you do it, but you can tell people, go away and tell people, Rod said, don't investigate Catholicism anymore.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. And that's, I want you to, if you can, Rod, now to connect, what you just said to Four Witnesses and what inspired that initial project, which I believe is now, it's like 20 years old, right?
It is indeed. This is the 20th anniversary this spring. So
wow. Well, congratulations. That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then
don't I look it?
You look fresh as a daisy. You look
years
fresh as a daisy to me. Great.
How nice.
Now,
All right.
so all right. So what then from that? Because you obviously did have, even if there was some resistance there, you clearly had openness of will, right? Or else you wouldn't be where you are right now. So what inspired
in fits and spurts, I had openness of will.
Sure. Yeah.
When I hid the book, I probably wasn't open. Probably wasn't in good faith, but I got it back out again. I was in a different frame of mind. So.
Yeah. So that's it's always, I always love hearing these personal elements of the story because they're so important, right? They really are. All right. So then what inspired Four Witnesses? And then if you can link us from Four Witnesses to the current book that you just wrote. This is a sequel that's obviously been a long time coming. And what else are you trying to accomplish with this newest book? But maybe, give that background about Four Witnesses first, in case anybody hasn't read that one yet.
Right. It's essentially my conversion story told in a slightly different way. It's basically, the whole point of it is I examined the early fathers and they led me to become Catholic.
Yep.
But since I'm more of a storyteller than I am really a polemicist, I wanted to tell the stories. The stories had engaged me and engaged not just the head, but the heart too. Mm-hmm. So I set out to write these 4 little miniature biographies of the 4 earliest Christian writers whose works have survived outside the pages of the New Testament. Mm-hmm. And by telling the story, make the quotes that people often just pull out and wave in your face, like checkmate atheist, Mm-hmm. I wanted to make those more meaningful. I wanted to fit them into the context of who they were and what was going on that caused them to write this, et cetera, et cetera.
And that's critical, because without the context, let's be honest, all sides can just do the quote mining game.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's bad for all of us.
That's right.
It's spiritually destructive.
I agree.
So that was the idea. Tell my conversion story in a roundabout way, but not so autobiographical as I've been doing, as you've compelled me to do for the last half hour. I told it in a more roundabout way. So that's what Four Witnesses was. I said these stories were so cool that I had to take them seriously enough to change my faith.
Yeah. Now, if the gentle listener has not read Four Witnesses, I can't recommend it highly enough. Of course, I'll include a link to that in the show notes as well. All right. So now, because you also have another great book in between, the Apostasy that wasn't. Maybe we'll have to have you back on just to talk about that one as well.
Well, that one's my favorite. So, and people don't talk about it enough. So,
well, hey, put a quick plug in if you want to, and then we can get to the newest one. It's phenomenal, right? Yeah.
It's the only book I know that does. The reason I wrote it is I couldn't find one on the same subject. Mm-hmm. After the idea that the early church was just home Christians with no rituals, no organization, no government, no officers. It was just, libertarian paradise. Everybody opened their Bible and tried to figure it out, and they met with like-minded people, and then there was the church. Contrary to that, I found, all sorts of proofs, in my estimation, at least, if not proofs, that the Catholic, I don't know that I lead everybody all the way to the Catholic Church in that first book, but I do lead them to rule out the idea that all of these Catholic ideas that sound so foreign to evangelicals didn't exist at the time of the early church. Not only do they exist, they existed in the earliest surviving writings we have.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And we have a lot more surviving writings than most people realize. Mm-hmm. So
So, that brings up another a point that was influential to me. And the more I thought about this, I think the more sense it makes too, consistent with the historical record, and also helps to illuminate it, right? And it involves, I think, a contemplation of human nature, of the nature of God, and what we might expect, from God in terms of a religion. And if you just think about humans for a bit, it doesn't take too long to realize that we're not just rational animals, but we're not like rational in a radical libertarian autonomous sense. We're social animals. We rely on tradition. We require authority, right? That's just how we operate. And if you think that there's a general principle that God sort of works with things according to their nature, right? The Catholic paradigm fits really well with that, like in many ways, especially epistemologically. Whereas the Protestant paradigm, I mean, forget even the more particular issues that are notorious and people go back and forth on, like sola scriptura, this or that. It just doesn't seem to accord well with human nature, right?
Right.
Whereas the Catholic one does. So I think for me, and this is a very Newman thing, and of course, I'm familiar with Newman, so he influenced me. It was this convergence of different considerations.
Right.
Human anthropology, philosophy of God, the historical testimony, and of course scripture itself too. We don't want to downplay that there's a strong case to be made. And then all of that kind of pushed in on me that I wound up where I am. What do you think of that? And do you have any other thoughts of how maybe the fathers fit into any of those considerations?
It was Cardinal Henry Manning, sometime antagonist of Father Newman's. They had a period where they were on the outs a little bit, but there was a happy ending. Cardinal Manning said, he's got one of the shortest, pithiest quotes on this that there is. He says, and he says this as a convert, having reached this conclusion after a pretty good struggle. He says, if Christianity is historical, then Catholicism is Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And in other words, one of the things that made, and I think still makes, radically Anabaptist forms of Christianity, that is Christianity without any history or liturgy or any of the other things. One of the things that makes that even possible is to have this giant 1,500-year gap in your timeline. Mm-hmm. There's the apostles, there's the day of Pentecost, there's we get up to St. John at Patmos and all the rest of it. And then there's this giant break until Martin Luther comes. There might be one or two little bright spots, Francis of Assisi or whatever.
Yeah.
If your teachers were a little bit broad-minded. Mm-hmm. You had this enormous 1,500-year gap where there were really no heroes to celebrate, no victories. It was just everything went kind of off the rails, and this alien power took over and was in charge for centuries. And then all of a sudden, Luther or Calvin or whoever your prophet is rediscovered it all, and took us back to the early church again. That's a radically unhistorical way of looking at the world in general.
Yes.
If your religion literally has no history, that one of the virtues of it is that it has no history. Everybody encountered, well, like I say, it was a hard day for me when I formulated a certain train of thought in this way. I said, okay, as far as I can tell, my religion up to this point has been, God left the Bible behind. Everybody's supposed to read it, try to figure it out. If you figure it out right, you go to heaven. If you figure it out wrong, you go to hell. And that's it.
Yeah.
The whole thing's a big test of character.
Yeah, it's really ultimately, I mean, it's kind of God asking the impossible of people. And I don't think that's a very consistent view of
and also the results speak for themselves.
Right.
You need only drive 10 miles down the nearest American highway and see 10 churches, and all of them telling it differently than the guys next door, So
I mean, this relates to the apostasy that wasn't, and it does seem right to me to say that if you're Protestant, right, you do have to think that things went off the rails in a big way for a long time.
Yeah.
Now, where exactly, of course,
Right.
varies. But I guess one of the problems that I would have if I was in that paradigm is worrying that maybe I'm a little too late in identifying where they went off the rails. Why not go back to where Mormons think they went off the rails?
Right.
Or something like that.
Or the Muslims.
Yeah. So that seems to be a difficulty that would legitimately concern me if I was in that paradigm. And I've heard and seen responses to that. I obviously don't find them convincing. But one thing that is sort of nice about being Catholic is that you just don't have that problem at all. It just never went.
Right.
Like, look,
under the same management since 33 AD. So
it's a good way of putting it.
You don't need to. That was one of the things I say in the introduction to the Apostasy is that most people agree that Constantine's the villain. I don't know how he got to be pegged so often.
Yeah, poor dude, right? Yeah,
obviously.
Yeah.
The moment where the Roman emperor stops persecuting and starts joining in the prayer is a big moment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And fraught with all sorts of interesting possibilities, not all of them good.
Right.
But so I guess it looms large in people's imaginations. They associate persecution with the pure early church and easy times with corruption and decadence and all the rest of it. So the book, The Apostasy That Wasn't, was written to debunk all of that. But there's a surprising amount of agreement that Constantine is the villain of the piece. But when you get to the other end and everybody picks who the prophet was that put things back on the rails, then you choose that by your own lights, whether it's Luther or Calvin or, Joseph Smith or whoever it is that you want to pick. We all agree to disagree on that. But yeah. So that was the idea behind apostasy, was to explode some of the myths of this great apostasy that happened supposedly in the 4th century.
Yeah. So
it's a lot of codswallop. The whole thing is from start to finish, and that's what the book's about.
Yeah, excellent. Well, that will be linked in the show notes too, and I hope everyone grabs a copy of that. So now your latest book, Rod. What is the project here that you're trying to accomplish? What is where are you trying to what gaps you're trying to fill, I guess is what I'm asking with this.
These 12 is about early after I discovered Lewis and was trying to be a Christian again as an adult, started going back to church, went to a college age retreat in Florida, met a young Baptist seminarian and had questions. I had already read enough Lewis to know that even though he was very friendly to the evangelical way of thinking in a lot of ways, he also had areas where, like I mentioned at the beginning of the program, where he had a strange way of talking about Mary or a strange way of talking about the Mass, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So I had questions. And he talked about the apostles sometimes and had a very high sounding view of the churches founded by the apostles. So I asked this friend of mine, a new friend, I just met him, asked him what he thought the role of the apostles was in the founding of Christianity. What was their ongoing role meant to be? And I was taken aback, even though I didn't know much about such things at the time. I was taken aback by the very abrupt, preemptive, almost testy quality in his response. He said, the apostles were nothing. They just happened to be the first Christians. Mm-hmm. Jesus used some of them to help write the New Testament, but other than that, they just happened to be the first round of Christians. We're just as important. You and I are just as important, and no less important than they were, and that it's all, And that was very odd, and I knew was not on the outs with a lot of what I was reading from my new friends.
Yeah.
Books. Right. And so that started me on a search to try to figure out if that is right. Even at the time, it sounded strange. I remembered that just from scripture only, I remembered that the New Testament has some kind of crazy things to say about the apostles, that the 12 apostles, that I had always thought that doesn't compute, like Jesus telling the apostles, you're in the new world, you're going to sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel.
Yeah.
Well, the more you know about the 12 thrones, the 12 patriarchs, that number 12, the 12 different stones that were on the breastplate of the high priest in the temple, each one named for one of the 12 patriarchs who sat on thrones judging the 12 tribes. The more you realize that's a crazy, crazy idea from the Davidic king, the new Davidic king, saying he's going to revive the 12 old patriarchs again. Was certainly big news in the first century AD. And then in St. John's Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, he sees a vision of the New Jerusalem. And when he sees it, a vision of heaven, of the dwelling place of God and man together. He says he looks at the foundation and he sees written the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Well, what on earth did these 12 lowly fishermen from Galilee do to get their names written on the pillars of heaven, the foundations of heaven? Which, of course, connects to another verse where St. Paul says that the household of God, the church, is built upon the foundation of the prophets, but also the apostles. And then John sees that vision where their names are literally written on the foundation of heaven. I also had noticed that, isn't it interesting that one of the very first things that happens in the book of Acts, right after Pentecost, right after the ascension and Christ goes back to heaven and then the Spirit comes, what's the first thing they do? Do they say, we need to have a council and plan out world evangelization, or we need to? No, they say, look, there's only 11 of us. That's not right. How can that be? There can't be just 11. Why not? No, they're in a big hurry to say we've got to find a 12th guy and get him in here. In fact, there's an Old Testament prophecy about it, and they cite it. They say, "Let his bishopric another take."
Yeah.
Okay, and in that they say, when one of these guys falters or fails, when one of us falters or fails, another one has to take his bishopric. Another one has to succeed him. There has to be some kind of, I don't know, call it apostolic succession.
Right.
We've got to have 12, and when one of us drops, another one's got to take his place.
Yeah.
So they very quickly have an election and choose a bench player in baseball terms.
Yeah.
To come in, and because he was Matthias and Bar Justus, the other candidate, Clement of Alexandria says they were both among the 70, the larger group of disciples that Christ picked before he narrowed a special group down to 12. So he had 70 bench players to choose from, and so Peter, being the manager, says we got to get somebody up from the minor leagues and put him in Judas's old spot. And but the sense of how important this is, and we can't move on until there's 12 again. That's a really strange idea. Why was that so important? So all of those things were things I had already noticed about the apostles that seemed to imply that, at the very least, that they had some sort of ongoing role in the age to come, that number 12 was important, and that the 12 will pick new replacements. They'll bring in a bench player when they need to. So all of those things together, to me, had already proved to me from Scripture alone that the apostles, that number 12 and the Jesus's picking of 12 is highly significant, and not just for the brief time that those men were alive on earth.
Yeah, that's really cool, and that's really good. There's something special happening here. Now, let me know if I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but before we started recording, you mentioned something that was really interesting to me, and that is this sort of tendency among both Protestants and Catholics. And it's sort of a disposition towards the apostles. You sometimes hear it in homilies, unfortunately, right? Where we kind of get comic relief from them, right? The way we look at them is obviously Catholics. We hold to apostolic succession, and we do believe that they had an enormously important role. But still, you're right. I mean, I was watching a segment the other day. I won't mention what it was, but it was laughing at St. Peter, which is often the case,
and not just from non-Catholics.
So this was a Catholic segment. Literally, this was a Catholic segment. So make that connection for me, Rod, if you can. What's the point you wanted to emphasize surrounding this, and how does it relate to the fundamental message of your book?
When I went to write a book about, well, that's what these 12 is a book where after my interview with the seminarian, I went off and began to try to justify his statement that they had no special role, and found that I wasn't able to do it. The book is going back through the Gospels, looking at the events from the apostles' eyes to see how they understood what had happened to them. What was it like to become one of the 12 apostles? What did they think had happened to them when it was over with? That's the thought experiment that the book is about. But one of the things I did was to go back and look at what the early fathers had to say about these things. And, that's ever since Four Witnesses, I guess that's what I do. I'm the guy that writes about the church fathers.
You're the church fathers guy. Absolutely.
Mainly because they won't publish anything I write except on that subject. So.
Well, you're great at it. So,
thank you.
Blessing and a curse, I suppose. Yeah.
So to see what the father, and the thing is, the fathers never talked like that. In other words,
never talked down.
The reverence that they use about the 12 is just slightly lower than that accorded to our Savior himself. And it was very striking that we often don't do that. Even if the church where the homily is happening has got the name of Peter or Andrew or somebody on it. When you get to stories where the apostles speak out of turn, and it does happen sometimes, where they seem to misunderstand the message, where they're barking up the wrong tree, there's no doubt that there are passages like this. Our 2020 hindsight leads us to think, it's obvious what the answer to that is. How could they say such a dumb thing, ask such a dumb question? Well, it was an extremely difficult question. All of the questions about how to square the messianic prophecies with the character of Jesus, the things he was doing and saying, how to square it with Old Testament prophecy. If you think that's an easy thing to explain, you need to find somebody who takes the other side on it, because you'll likely get your butt handed to you.
Yes. Yeah.
And so they were in the midst of living through one of the most difficult teaching courses ever offered.
Yeah.
And they started out with great advantages. That's another thing that's way, way overemphasized, is the lowly, humble quality of the apostles. Yes, they were lowly and humble, not many great, not many wise, et cetera, but not in any sense other than what Christ would be applicable to Christ himself. He didn't go to university. He didn't study under Aristotle or Plato or any of these other things. He was a working class man himself. So, but this humble, God chose the humble, lowly things. Well, he chose that for Christ too, but it didn't mean that we can treat him as if he were somebody that you can second guess and despise because of it. So in reality, Josephus, one of the nuggets that I found while doing my research for this, is the Jewish historian Josephus says that Galilee was actually maybe the most cosmopolitan part of Judea, the old Holy Land. To get to Phoenicia. Phoenicia, if you know much about ancient history, you know how important the port city of Phoenicia was. In fact, the alphabet that I used to write these 12 in is from Phoenicia. So, but it was the great port city of the world, of the Roman world, and all the cosmopolitan currents of the Roman Empire flowed through Phoenicia. And Phoenicia is right there with Tyre and Sidon and the places that Jesus talks about. And Galilee is right there. To get to Phoenicia, you had to go through Galilee. So Josephus says that everybody in Galilee knew how to speak Greek. They knew how to speak. Some of them knew Latin. He also says that all the Jewish synagogues in the region had synagogue schools where they sent virtually all boys, so that all the boys were educated. So the ignorant, illiterate picture that you sometimes get of the apostles, that they couldn't read or that they, the other things, according to the historical records, that's an assumption.
Right.
Also, we know that at least 4 of the 12 apostles, well, okay, we know for a fact 3, and we have very high probability for the 4th. 4 of the 12 apostles were disciples of John the Baptist before they were disciples of Christ. Jesus, I'll remind everybody, said that St. John the Baptist was the greatest of all the Old Testament prophets, that he was the greatest Old Testament figure. So think about the curriculum that the apostles have then.
Right.
They spent some years under the greatest Old Testament prophet who led them, who schooled them on how to recognize Messiah when he comes.
Yeah.
Then they were personally turned over to graduate school with Messiah himself. Okay.
Not too bad. Yeah.
These were some of the most and think about it. That's what the Old Testament is a long course of training to teach God's chosen people how to recognize Messiah when he comes.
Right. Yeah.
That's really all it is.
And not how to fall into idolatry. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And we do hear about a remnant. We hear about those that were at the temple praying for Messiah every day, awaiting the consolation of Israel. And the remnant that was still actively looking. Well, these 12 had to be in the top tier of that. People who were praying every day, recognizing every day that their job was to be on the lookout.
Yeah.
So the idea that Christ just walked up to rank strangers, and certainly he could have taken men who had no biblical knowledge, no biblical training, who didn't know about anything but fishing and had never read a book in their lives. He could have done that. The question is that how he actually chose to act?
And would that have been befitting given everything that has come before?
Right.
Exactly. And the answer is no. Right.
And so when you go to, when you laugh at their foolish questions, or that's 20/20 hindsight causing you to be irreverent in a way that's not fitting.
Yeah.
I'll give the supreme example if we've got just a few minutes more.
We do, of course. Yeah.
Okay.
Go,
all right. Often given as the best example of, you can hardly hear a homily on the Transfiguration without having Peter made the brunt of the joke.
Oh yeah. You're right.
Remember, Christ appears in glory, no mistaking now that he is an angelic being of some kind, that he's miraculous. He's not just an ordinary human being. He's a human being, but not an ordinary human being. And that the 2 greatest figures of the apostles' religious training, Moses, the lawgiver, and Elijah, the greatest of the prophets, so great that he didn't even die. He was carried to heaven on a chariot of fire.
Yep.
The 2 of them are standing with Jesus, but very significantly, Jesus is in the middle. Okay. And they are discussing with him, we're told, the Exodus, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Moses knows a thing or two about an Exodus. So, but this glorious vision, and the 3 apostles that were chosen to receive it personally, they have got to be dumbstruck, thunderstruck. One of the greatest visions of biblical history, right up there with all the great apparitions of sacred history. And it says that Peter, after Elijah and Moses said, well, maybe, is it after or before, while they're still there? At any rate, he says, this is fantastic, Lord. This is incredible. He says, let's just stay here and fellowship like this. I mean, who wouldn't want to just camp out and picnic with God, with Christ and Moses and Elijah for a while?
Right.
So he said, let's just stay here. Let's make some tents.
Yep.
Just stay up here. We're having a mountaintop experience. I don't want to kill the buzz. He says, let's make 3 tents up here and just stay.
Yeah.
Okay. And the evangelist steps in at this point, and this is one of the justifications for making a joke out of it. The evangelist steps in at this point and says, Peter said this because he didn't know what he was talking about.
Yeah.
Okay. And of course, that's proof that he's just a bumbling oaf, a big fisherman who, doesn't know what he's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, think about it this way. Peter is not just a bumbling big fisherman. He knows the Old Testament backward and forward, probably reads Hebrew, which most Jews didn't do by that point, all the rest of it. He knows that every year the Jews have a festival. They still do today. The Jews have a festival called the Festival of Sukkot, the Festival of Booths, okay? Also known as the Festival of Tabernacles, to give you a bit of a spoiler, okay? That festival, which if you go in Jewish communities, you'll see in September every year, the Jews have a big camp out. They go out into a park or a campground or someplace. They set up a bunch of big circus tents or smaller tents, family tents, big, tents. And they just hang out for a few days and drink wine and picnic and enjoy each other's company. But the point of the festival, which again goes back to apostolic times or before, the point of it was a festival celebrating the time when Israel was sheltered during the Exodus in tents, where they slept out in tents every night during the Exodus. It's a commemoration of that event, but it's also a commemoration of the fact that the Ark of the Covenant was there with them in the middle of the campsite. Okay. Now, if you know how the Talmud describes the Ark of the Covenant, it talks about the Shekinah of God dwelt there. And in the Old Testament, it's very strange. I never even knew this until fairly recently. The Old Testament is very explicit, especially in the original Hebrew, that the Ark is the place where Moses went to talk to God. Okay. And an audible voice came from a certain spot on the Ark, which they called the oracle, or the root of oracle, of course, is oration, the place where he spoke. Okay. And it's between the wings of the angels. When Moses heard the voice of God, it came from there. Okay. So the people spoke of the Ark as containing the actual presence of Yahweh. Okay. Not that they thought that he only dwelt there, but that it was there in a special way.
In a special way, right?
Yeah. Just as we think of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. So, another name that the Hebrews have for the festival of Sukkot is the festival of Emmanuel, the festival of God with us. In other words, it's a celebration of the time that we all went out camping with God. Okay. That we all had a big family gathering for a while, and that it all happened there when it wasn't great. The glory days when God was right there among us. When we needed an answer to a question, Joshua would just go in the tent and listen to the voice. So it was a celebration. But of course, everybody who has seen Indiana Jones knows that the Ark was lost at one point and it wasn't there anymore. So after that, the people began to talk about Emmanuel in a different sense. They began to keep the festival as the festival of the God who used to be with us. In other words, it had a bittersweet quality. At that point. Okay. And as they kept the festival year after year without the Ark, but still with the tents, it was a call. It was meant by them as a calling out. Come back. Come back. We miss you. We wish we still had the Ark that had the presence of God in it with us. Okay. So that's what the festival was all about. Well, this, to a guy like Peter, who surely knew all of this. The decision, let's build tents and stay here. Let's build one for Jesus and put him under it too. Okay. That takes on a whole new light. The more you know about this.
That's not a dumb thing to suggest.
Right. Yeah. We're going to shelter Jesus under a tent, just the same way that we used to shelter the Ark, and for the same reason.
Yes. Right. Makes perfect sense.
Actually. Oh yeah. Peter's knows what's up now. He knows what's going on here. Okay. So now, but why then does the gospel writer say he said this because he didn't know what he was talking about? Well, most of the early fathers say it was because Peter thought the happy ending was here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we know from the rest of the Old Testament that the marriage supper of the Lamb, where we really will sit at table with God in the flesh,
Yep.
and camp out with God, and just sit around and drink wine under the tents and stuff. We know that really is Christ's own image for the consummation of all things, the happy ending of the story. So Peter's mistake seems to be that he thought the happy ending was here already.
It was just the wrong part of the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He unlike us, who know whose hindsight is 2020,
Mm-hmm.
he thought, hey, here's the happy ending. Messiah is here. We're going to come down now and put things in order. The whole kingdom will make him king, and he'll drive out the Romans and all the rest of the wonderful things we expect from Messiah.
And it's because he knew so much that he had that expectation, not because he
Exactly.
was some ignorant oath.
And
right.
all the imagery of God dwelling with us, supping with us, and fellowshipping with us is there. The only thing he doesn't know is that there's some bad stuff to go through first.
Right.
That the happy ending, it's not the happy ending yet.
Yeah.
That there's a few more miles to walk to the happy ending.
Yeah.
So he was not wrong to want to put Jesus under a tent. He was not wrong to say that the final happy ending will be camping out with God under a tent. What he was missing was that he still didn't understand that the Son of Man had to suffer and be betrayed.
Right. Well,
so,
now I'm just going to say now, Rod, you've done again a blessing and a curse. A blessing is that hopefully this will greatly illumine the context. But now, anytime anybody sits to a homily again, where Peter's the sort of butt of the joke in that context, they're going to be.
They'll have to go talk to Father after.
Yeah, exactly.
Which he never likes, and they don't like doing it. Hopefully, they don't like doing it. Take them a copy. Here's the book. These 12. Buy some of these and give them to Father every time you hear a bad homily about the Transfiguration.
Well, please actually tell us more about that right now, because I mean we've scratched the surface on a number of different things that actually kind of range across all of your books, but this is the newest one, these 12. So if you wouldn't mind, Rod, tell us a little bit more about what people can expect out of this book, what types of questions it's going to answer for them, and the best place to get it would also be convenient to know.
If you want, this was my attempt to do a one-stop shopping answer for people who don't understand why Catholics confess one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Why the special role for the apostles? Why are we hung up on apostolic succession and all the rest of it? A priesthood, all of that. All of those issues are in the call of the apostles and the special things that Jesus did with them and to them. So if you wanted to read these books in order, start with these 12 in chronological order. These 12, 4 witnesses, 4 more witnesses, Scripture Wars, which is about Justin Martyr and Marcion and Aquila, 2 heretics. Then the apostasy that wasn't. So if you read them in that order, you'd have a pretty good, at least I think, pretty good story of the fathers up through about the year 360. So
that is a phenomenal recommendation, Rod. I will be sure to link all those books.
Right.
I'll even try and do it in the order that you gave in the show notes, so people have access there. Again, can't recommend it enough. Please do check out not just one, but all those books.
Yeah, specifically for these 12, go to Catholic.com. It's published by Catholic Answers Press. So Catholic.com, super easy to remember, and you can get the book directly from them.
And then what about you, Rod? What's next? Working on anything coming down the pipeline, and how can people just keep up with everything you're doing in general?
Well, I wrote 2. I hate to say it, I am a man of the 20th century. I live on a farm from the 18th century, so, or not really, early 19th. So I'm not real tech savvy. I've just recently figured out how to do Zoom. So after a long struggle, so if that seems really pathetic to you, you're not wrong. So I don't have some sort of wonderful website. If I had a bunch of young techie friends like you, I would have some kind of online presence, but I don't. I was on Facebook for a while until I realized that was nothing but a lot of
not the
vexation of
healthiest
spirit.
environment, right?
Vexation
Yes.
of
So
spirit.
I actually envy your position. I do. So someday I might be joining you out in the hills there. So
I just got my first cell phone earlier this year, so that gives you some idea of. I'm not really a troglodyte or some kind of Luddite. I might be a troglodyte. I'm not really a Luddite. So,
well, it's funny you laugh, but the goal really for people like me is you see somebody who is living with all this sort of poetic knowledge, as we like to call it, right? And there's something very much attractive about that, and trying to remove ourselves from this technological nihilism that we're sort of in. Yeah,
it's worrisome. Yeah. So, yep. It's funny. I recently gave a talk on the subject of the RCIA and how the early fathers did Christian initiation in the early centuries to a whole room full of priests, to the bishop of Knoxville and to all of his priests. I was called to talk on this subject to them. How that happened, I don't know. So, but as I was doing it, I would try to make some Latin quotes. I had Latin quotes in the text from Newman and things. So I would get ready to get started to try to pronounce some Latin. And I suddenly looked up and said, I'm literally the only person in this room that doesn't know at least a little bit of Latin. So I had to apologize in advance and say, this is going to be a mess. So I forget who gave the good quote. When you hear somebody mispronounce something, don't laugh at them, because it means they learned it from a book rather than hearing it. Everything I know, I learned from books. So there's going to be comical moments like that.
That's a great quote. I'm going to hold on to that. Well, Rod Bennett, God bless you. Thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. Again, I'm going to encourage people to go out, grab those books, and grab a bunch of them because they're great books to hand out. So just thank you so much, Rod. We'd love to do this again at some point.
Yeah, I hope you'll have me back again. This was fun. Enjoyed it.